Welcome to part 2 of this 3-part introductory episode. In this part, we'll take a look at some of the practicals of reality-based thinking, and then I'll give you an introduction into the different types of videos that I'll be producing. And in part 3, we'll take a look at our first word problem that highlights some of the common thinking errors that plague us in politics and religion, and we'll also look at some of what the Bible has to say about thinking. So let's jump right in with some practicals. Now, this may come as a shock to some, but what we think things are like is not always what they are really like. Sometimes we actually get things wrong. So let's look at some simplified big picture reasons that things go wrong, and then we'll get a bit more specific later. Here's the simplified big picture pyramid of thinking errors. Any of these things can lead to errors. At the basis of it all is the question of whether or not you or I care to get our thinking right on any particular issue. Now, our caring could be an overall thing about our moral disposition, or just at the moment of any particular thinking it comes into play. Regardless, care is at the bottom of this pyramid, as the foundation. Then the next tier on our pyramid has these 3 blocks. The first one is the question of whether you are thinking or not. Are you engaged or not? If you are behaving like a cognitive miser, you're simply not engaging deliberate cognitive activities, and it's very likely to lead you to an error. It's not a sure thing, mind you, and we can talk about that some other time, but it is likely. The next question is whether you already know how to think through this particular type of problem, whatever that problem might be. This deals with what we call mindware, and we'll get into that some other time also. And finally, on that second row of the pyramid comes the question of whether you are running any cognitive biases or other corrupt patterns of thinking in your mind. Say, for example, that the problem you're working on today is who to hire for your office manager position, and that the candidate with the best work history is an Italian, but that you have a long-standing bias that says all Italians are thieves. You know, or should know, that not all Italians are thieves, yet you hold to this irrational belief anyway. That's a bias. So, with no specific information on whether this particular Italian is a thief or not, you decide not to hire him. Now, that's a thinking error. It's a shortcut in your thinking, but it's going to be frequently wrong, even if it does happen to be right from time to time. That is, every once in a while, some Italian you meet does turn out to be a thief. And that brings us to the top of our simplified big picture pyramid, where I put the one solid piece that represents whatever specific errors that might be the outcome of our compromised thinking. We'll get into all that later. Now, every piece in this pyramid, for those who are watching the video, every piece is red, showing it in the negative state. But that doesn't mean that anytime we make an error, it's because all these blocks are messed up. Having a problem with just one of these blocks could cause an error in one's thinking. So let's just walk through in a simple fashion from the bottom up. Not that these are the only possible combinations, mind you. Again, this is much simplified, but I think this will be adequate to understand the basics of how it all works. So let's take that bottom block and let's turn it from red to green, and let's change the don't care to care. That is, that I care about what kind of person I am, at least in this one moment of thinking, and that I care to get things right. The next step is to engage the mind, up on the second level, to commence the actual thinking necessary to work the problem or question. Then comes being sure that we know how to solve the particular problem, and that we've learned and are using whatever mindware is needed, whether it be math or logic or language or probability or whatever else it might be in this particular case. Then we want to be sure that we're deliberately shunning any biases or other corrupted thinking methods we might be tempted to use. And once all of that is in its proper place, we get to the top of the pyramid, where finally we switch from having had errors before to having no errors now. Now, this is a fairly simple way to look at it, and there are a few finer points to add to our understanding of this later, but even this model alone is very useful in understanding something about how our minds work and what can go wrong when we mess up. So that's the top-level taxonomy of thinking errors. But now I want to get more specific and practical by showing you a list of 13 troubleshooting items, because they're a bit less abstract and more practically stated. So this will be a good introduction into some of the bricks in the foundation of reality-based thinking. The items on this next list are going to be particularly associated with what kinds of things go on in our minds here on this middle row of our three pyramid rows. That is, they're going to have to do with whether we're thinking or not, whether we know how to think correctly about the particular problem, and whether we are engaging any cognitive biases. So here's the troubleshooting list. Reality-based thinking troubleshooting list. The following elements related to thinking are not always accurate and are closely monitored in RBT. Sensory perception, what you take in through your physical senses. Interpretation of evidence, how you process what you take in. Assumptions, what you believe without vetting. Memory, how you recall things to be or to have been. Communication, how information passes between people. Attention and distraction, are you as alert as is necessary? Mindware, do you have the necessary thinking skills? Biases, your habitual mental cheats. Moods and feelings, emotions associated with a given subject. Hunches, what just seems right to you about what's real. Habits, what you normally do or what you did last time. Hope and desire, is your hope or desire overriding good thinking? Hearsay, what others say. So there's the troubleshooting list, and there are certainly other items we could put on it, but this list will certainly cover most of the thinking errors that people make. Chances are pretty good that there are hardly any thinking errors made without at least one of these things going on. So let's get practical. Let's deal with a run-of-the-mill sort of error and see how some of this pans out. Let's suppose we have a friend named Billy, and suppose we want to know something about how the world is, so we decide to ask Billy to tell us. Now, we could ask Billy about any subject, but let's make this one simple today. Let's suppose we were to ask Billy to tell us about the shape of the United States map. So we go to Billy and ask him to draw us an outline of the 48 contiguous states of the United States from memory. Let's suppose that Billy were to draw something like this. And let's suppose that you and I want to vet Billy's view of how things are because we're cool like that. So we find a map online, and we lay Billy's map on top of it to see how well they match. Now, if we were to do this, it would quickly become very obvious to us, if it were not already obvious, how good or bad Billy's map is in various ways. This would be an empirical exercise where we deal with actual verifiable observation and experience and measurement rather than assumptions or theoretical work or memory work. And if we were to do that, if we were to actually examine the matter for ourselves, both Billy's take on the shape of the continental United States and a map that is produced by scientific means, then this would say a lot about what kind of people we are on this particular subject. And I already told you, of course, that we're cool like that. So this leads us to some questions as to what Billy might be like. Does he understand that his beliefs about things don't come from those things themselves, but from other processes such as his sensory perceptions of the things, as gathered through his physical senses, such as in this case his sense of sight? And what about his memory of those perceptions? How accurate is that? Has he got this map memorized in its every feature? Or is his memory of some features better than that of others? And then what about his own inner cognitive processes that result in his interpretations of those perceptions and memories? How good is that? And what about all the mental processes involved with iterating or communicating that to us in this picture? As you can see, those of you who are watching on this video anyway, there's a lot to be taken into consideration here. There's a lot that goes into the process. But how aware is Billy of all that? Is he the sort of person who will oversimplify the whole process and tell you that he gets his beliefs about things directly from the things themselves, as if it were impossible that he might not have perceived or seen them accurately, remembered accurately what he saw, and interpreted the information correctly, or replicated it correctly by drawing? As it turns out, we as humans are quite vulnerable to errors in these and other particulars. But is Billy the sort of person to recognize and admit this about himself? Or is he the sort to be overconfident in his own mental abilities? And there's one more question that I want to ask about what kind of person Billy is. When you show him his errors, will he correct himself? Will he conform his beliefs to match with reality, or will he say, as many do, "Well, that may be, but I still think"? If Billy's like most people, he's willing to admit some of his errors, but not all of them. If he's like most people, he will deal honestly, rationally, and responsibly with some things, but not others. And if he's like most people, he'll correct himself on some things, but not others. With reality-based thinking, however, the goal is to be honest, rational, and responsible in all matters, all the time, including correcting oneself as needed to keep oneself in line with reality. That's what RBT is. And it's a way of life. It's a matter of one's cognitive disposition and moral disposition. It's about honesty, rationality, and responsibility. The fact of the matter is that while some things about reality are pretty simple, other things about reality can get pretty complicated and just aren't as simple as we might like them to be. The more details something has, the easier it is to get it wrong in our understanding, in one way or another. And the easier it is to get it wrong when talking to other people about it. But what should we do about all this? Should we roll up our sleeves and get to work, or should we make it a habit simply to avoid the heavy lifting that's necessary in some things? Well, for most it seems that last option sounds more attractive. And even if they do learn how to exert themselves in some things, they may well take the lazy way out in other things. In fact, before they know it, they might have whiled their lives away pouting against reality and the work that it takes to live authentic lives in a real world. Not in every way, but in some ways. On this show, I'll be largely concerned with the high cost of taking the easy way out when it comes to information, and particularly when it comes to facts, logic, and sourcing. Let me share one quotation that comes up several times a week in all my discourse with my fellow humans. It's from Mark Twain's autobiography. It was published in 1907, and in my estimation, it's likely as true of us today as it was of people in his day. Here's the quote. "In religion and politics, people's beliefs and convictions are in almost every case gotten at second-hand, and without examination, from authorities who have not themselves examined the questions at issue, but have taken them at second-hand from other non-examiners whose opinions about them were not worth a brass farthing." That's the end of the quote. Well, I'm here to tell you that we do a lot of this kind of bad mental work. We are a hearsay culture. We are a meme culture. It's amazing how often we mindlessly repeat ignorant things that we get from our friends and acquaintances, as well as from the news and the Facebook news feed. This is a very bad thing about us, and we're going to get into all of this in the course of this show. This is what we're like, and you know that you know people like this. What you might not know is how much you tend to be like this yourself. In this series, I'm going to show you some word problems, some thinking problems that most people in our culture miss. And when I say most, I mean something like 80% or more in some cases. That's about 4 in 5 people who lack either the skills or the diligence, or both, to use their mind to solve problems that are definitely solvable. We're going to talk about politics and religion and plenty of other things, and all throughout, we're going to talk about what kind of people we are and what kind of people we could be if we wanted to be. The opportunity for error is immense, especially when you're not thinking, when you've got that system turned off. One of my favorite Three Stooges skits speaks unwittingly to this. In it, Curly starts yelling, "I can't see, I can't see," and Larry says, "What's the matter?" Then Curly says, "I've got my eyes shut." Well, of course we can't see if we've got our eyes shut, and I'm here to tell you that in our culture, we generally walk around with our eyes shut to many things, even if we're really trying to keep them open to other things. We believe with high confidence far more things than we can actually prove. We run far more habits than actually work well. We say far more things than are actually true. And we rarely stop to examine these things. So our opinions about them, however adamant they may be, aren't worth a brass farthing, as Twain would put it. A brass farthing, by the way, is a really cheap coin, practically worthless. Just having an opinion on a matter does not mean that our eyes are open to the facts of that matter. I'll be speaking as an American here, since I live in the United States. When it comes to politics, our nation does many things that are dishonest, irrational, and irresponsible. That is the opposite of reality-based thinking. We operate at a deficit. We have major corruption in our government, mostly unchecked. We interfere in the affairs of other nations to benefit our own markets, even if it's done in the guise of helping others or policing the world or, quote, making the world safe for democracy, end quote. And most of this is in violation of our own Constitution, and most of us generally keep our eyes shut to the facts about all this. Millions of Americans swear an oath to our Constitution, and yet very few have ever even read the whole thing. Twain would call them non-examiners on this topic. Is it any wonder, then, that we argue so much over the Constitution and what it means and how it ought to be applied? Indeed, who better to mess it up than a country full of people who don't read the rules by which it is supposed to operate? And let me point out that I'm not bringing this up in order to argue a political side, but to argue a philosophical point about how undiligent we are. You can like the Constitution, or you can hate it, or you can be somewhere in between, but the fact of the matter is that we have one that we're not following. And I ask you, what sort of people would have a Constitution but not follow it? What sort of people would let that go on year after year, decade after decade, century after century even, and not fix it? If we don't like it anymore, why not amend it accordingly? And if we do like it, why not enforce it? But we choose to live in the aggregate, that is, when you consider all of us lumped together with all our habits and beliefs mixed up into one big slurry like concrete. We choose to live in a messy, unruly political state rather than to govern ourselves in an orderly fashion. And why is that? It's generally because of what kind of people we are. We're like that horse running about with that one lazy leg, a leg we could be using but aren't, because we'd rather not go to the trouble. And that brings me to religion. Since America is predominantly Christian, and since that's my own background, I'll be speaking very little about other religions on this show. But we're definitely going to talk about religion in general and about Christianity in particular. So with that in mind, I just want to introduce the topic of religion here with a question. Based on what we've been discussing already about what kind of people we are in this society, and about the high percentages who miss some very basic word problems about rationality, what should we expect when it comes to understanding the Bible? Should we expect that most people are pretty much going to get most of it right? I say no. Based on my study of rationality these past few years, I would expect most of us to get several important things about the Bible wrong. Let me explain why. The Bible has about 1,100 pages, 31,000 verses, and 780,000 words. It has 66 books, some of which are actually comprised from multiple documents themselves. They were written in 3 now-dead languages, and include lots of words borrowed from other now-dead languages. And to make things even trickier, it has several words in it, the definitions of which are uncertain. They were written in the ancient Near East culture, one quite unlike our own in several ways, separated from us by half the globe and by about 2,000 years. They were written over a span of about 1,500 years by multiple authors. Further, the Bible has a lot of literal language in it and a lot of figurative language in it, and it doesn't always tell you which is which. A society of mostly non-examiners, like Mark Twain was talking about, is just not going to do well with a complicated set of documents like the Bible. And we don't. We have tremendous disagreement about what it says and what it means and what ought to be done about it all. And good luck finding anyone who wants to responsibly discuss a really big-picture question, like one about how much things have changed in the churches from the first century until now, or about how much they were supposed to change from then till now. It's a fantastic mess, our collective understanding of the Bible, and it makes perfect sense that a society that has so many thinking errors generally in play would also make those errors when it comes to their understanding and use of the Bible. But who is tackling this mess of thinking? This mess in politics and religion and everything else in our culture? Who's tackling that? Many out there are arguing their conclusions about this or that, saying they're better than the other guy's conclusions. But who is setting out to reform the methods by which our culture thinks, so that we can get the really important things like politics and religion on straight? Or at least straighter than before. Well, many might seem to be taking a stab at that, but they're doing it from the position that says, my position is better than yours. That is, they're comparing themselves to others. And I'm going to submit to you that that's not the best measuring stick to use. If you play by a rule that says all you have to do is to be better than the next guy, then who is ever going to get you to be better than you? That is, to be better than you are already. I submit that we all ought to measure ourselves on our beliefs and plans and ideas, not against those of others, but against reality itself. Hence my brand, reality-based thinking. And if we were to do that, we would definitely discover some faults in many of the positions that the reformers are trying to get us to adopt, as well as in many of the positions that the traditionalists want us to keep. Not all of them, mind you, but many. The problem of how people think, however, is not a problem that can be solved on the whole without solving it first in individuals. And that means we're in luck because we are all individuals. And we are all individuals who can fix ourselves. And while we might find it somewhat satisfying to fuss about what all is wrong in the thinking of other people, if we refuse to survey our own thinking, then we are doing the very thing that we wish others would stop doing. That is why this show is ultimately about what's wrong with my thinking and yours, because you and I are the only ones who can do anything about it. A few years ago, I started discovering some common errors about politics and religion, and I noticed that it was really hard to get people to change their minds, even when you could prove that they were wrong about something. So I got really serious about it, and I began to read and study over 30 books related to this question, some of them not for the first time. And I read countless articles and had countless discussions, and that's where I started to learn about some of the observations being made these last few decades in cognitive science. Observations about our typical thinking errors and what goes wrong and why. I had in mind to write a book to help other people think better. And as I got into the nuts and bolts of what all goes into rational thinking, I discovered that there are several word problems that have been in use in cognitive science, problems that tend to demonstrate certain flaws in our thinking. So I tried to answer these problems, and I found that I was missing over half of them. Naturally, this was very troubling to me, and ironic too, since I was wanting to write a book to help other people. But I was brave enough to tough it out, and what I learned was that yes, I had some bad thinking habits that predictably caused me to get some things wrong, but that these habits could be unlearned and better ones learned in their place, and that I could get better and better in my thinking every year. I'm not perfect, mind you, but I'm definitely doing better than before, and I'm still learning. In fact, I like to joke that I suffer from a severe and deepening mental order, and I call myself a recovering cognitive miser. I thought it would be good to share one of those word problems with you in this episode. I'll be doing that throughout the series, sharing the problems and then discussing their answers and what normally goes wrong when we miss them, and then discussing what happens when we make these same kinds of errors in the more important areas of life, such as religion or politics or health. Just so you know, each of these word problems will be getting its own separate video, and then in these episodes, I'll be importing those videos whenever I want to highlight one of those problems. In addition to the word problem videos, I'll also be showing lots of super short videos, normally from 30 to 60 seconds, and they generally display a simple graphic explaining the various building blocks of the whole approach to thinking. You've already seen a couple of them in this episode. The black ones show RBT foundations, the fundamental ideas. The green ones show common RBT skills. The blue ones show common mindware needs. The purple ones show things commonly neglected in people's thinking. The ones in red show common fallacies. The ones in yellow show common cognitive biases. And finally, the ones in orange show some of the self-breaking rules that plague our society. So as time goes by, You'll see a profusion of these short videos appear, and because each one is short and sweet, they can be pulled into my episodes so that when, say, cognitive bias or the no true Scotsman fallacy comes up in conversation, I can just pop that little snippet of video up to explain what that bias or fallacy is. And that's what we're about to do with this first word problem that will be in part 3 of this introductory episode. The word problem videos are longer than the ones I just talked about. They're each going to be roughly 10 or 15 minutes long. Each of these videos presents a word problem, gives you time to answer it, and then gives you the correct answers. Then they discuss the errors that are commonly made. So here we are at the end of part 2 of this 3-part introductory episode, and I'll introduce the first word problem at the beginning of part 3. It's the Jack, Ann, and George problem, and it's a problem of the sort that will be on the upcoming rationality quotient test. Also in part 3, we'll take a look at some of what the Bible says about the importance of good thinking. And you might just be surprised to see that cognitive science and the Bible both seem to be addressing some of the same issues. So that's the end of part 2, and I hope you'll watch part 3 right now.